Charlotte pulled herself onto the beach and pushed her hair back off her face in a cascade of water. She took a couple of deep breaths, quietly pleased by the fact that she was not more affected by her swim. As she let her heart rate and breathing settle, she untied the string from around her waist and freed her plastic sandals. They had spent the swim bobbing along at her side, gently tapping her thighs every now and again as if to remind her of their existence. Now she let them fall to the ground and slid her feet into them. Water squeezed under her feet and around her toes, spilling out onto the wet sand. Then, walking away from the sea, she let her eyes rise to the object of her visit, the little blue and white church. Charlotte had seen the church the first time she had looked out from her hotel room window, perhaps half a mile out from shore. Nestling into the vibrant blue sea was a tiny island. It seemed to be little more than an upthrust of grey rock from the ocean, its flanks covered in scrubby green foliage. Its lower slopes looked gentle, but there was a central outcrop of rock that appeared almost cubic, as though cut by some giant hand with a dull knife. This mass was settled onto the centre of the island, as though the same hand that had cut it had placed it down, forcing it into the earth like a cake decoration into icing. Its sides were almost vertical and striated with dark fissures, and it looked to be 50 or 60 feet tall, although Charlotte found it hard to judge this accurately, and changed her mind every time she gazed at it. The church was in front of the outcrop, tiny and colourful against the doleful grey of the rock face. Its walls were a startling white with blue edging, the roof a wash of the same blue. By squinting, Charlotte could just make out a door in the front of the building and a cross set at the front of the roof. At night, the church was lit by a pale yellow light that flickered in time with the wind. Charlotte assumed that oil lamps hung around its exterior. The light made its walls shimmer and stand out starkly against the grey stone mass behind it. The mass itself loomed even more at night, rearing and blocking out the stars in the Greek darkness. It gave the impression of being man-made. The crags and fissures became the battlements of a castle, abandoned and decaying, but resisting a final collapse with bleak force. It too appeared lit at its base by the same yellowing illumination. Charlotte never saw anyone light the lamps. In fact, as hard and as often as she looked, and she spent long periods of time simply staring at the island, to Roger's irritation, she only ever saw one person at the church, and then for no more than a fleeting moment, a shadow framed in the doorway, seen in the corner of her eye as she turned away, that was gone by the time she turned back. It had to be a person, she told herself. Someone lit the lamps, and the church was well cared for. Its sides, the two that she could see from her hotel balcony at least, were the white of freshly painted stone or brick, and the blue roof and trim were neat and well defined. The low wall that surrounded the church corralled ground that was clear of plants or noticeable litter. It was curiously entrancing, this little blue and white building with its domed roof and dark doorway, and Charlotte studied it for hours. It was Roger who put the idea in her head. "Why don't you swim out there?" he asked, on about the third day of their holiday. "If you see it up close, you might stop staring at it all the time." Charlotte could hear the irritation in his voice, but also the joking tone. She knew he was simply trying to draw her attention back to him and their break together, but the idea took hold in her mind and would not let go. The next day she said to him, "It's not that far, is it? And the sea's fairly calm around here." "You're serious?" he asked. "Of course," she said, and couldn't help adding, "It was your idea, after all." Charlotte planned the great swim, as Roger had taken to sarcastically calling it, for the second week of their break. It gave her time to get used to swimming in the sea, to feel the way it pulled and pushed at her. It also gave her the opportunity to ask around about the little church, but no one seemed to know anything about it. The holiday company's representative merely shrugged, and the locals looked at her blankly when she asked. One said, It's just an old church," and looked at Charlotte as though she were mad. But it wasn't. It was not old, not to look at anyway. This apparent disinterest in the church, which made Roger more dismissive of her plan, only strengthened her resolve, and by the morning of the swim she was determined to reach it, to feel its stonework for herself. The path from the beach to the church was steeper than it had looked from the mainland, and Charlotte had to scramble and grasp at plants and roots to support her on her ascent. The climb was more tiring than the swim, and she reached the top grateful that she had not needed to go further. Grit had worked its way into her sandals, and her feet felt hot and scratched by the time she reached her destination. Her hands were grimy and sore. When she placed her hands on the top of the low wall and felt the heat of the sun on the rock and saw the church, however, all her aches were forgotten. Close to, the building was even prettier than she expected. She wanted to walk straight to it, marvel at its simple beauty, but before she could, she had to deal with Roger. Standing by the wall, she turned back towards the beach, across the strip of blue sea. "I swam that," she thought proudly. The wedge of golden sand gleamed in the late morning sun. She located Roger's tiny, frail form by finding the hut that sold fresh fruit and cold drinks, and looking just in front of it, the way they had arranged. There, beside a family group, sat Roger. She raised one arm in greeting and saw him do the same in return. At least now he would not worry, and might even start to relax a little. "Ah, Roger," she thought, "what are we going to do with you?" Back home his constant attentiveness was flattering. Here, its focus unbroken by time apart for work, and without the diluting presence of other friends, it had become claustrophobic. She could not move, it seemed, without him asking if she was all right, or if she wanted anything. The great swim had appealed, in part at least, because it gave her time away from him. He was neither a strong enough swimmer nor adventurous enough to want to do it with her, and although she felt a little guilty at taking advantage of his weakness, she revelled in the freedom that it gave her. She could not see their relationship continuing after they returned home, and although this made her sad, it was a distant sadness rather than a raw grief. With Roger hopefully placated, Charlotte turned again to the church. The path up from the beach had brought her to a spot directly facing the door, which hunched inside a shadowed patch surrounded by a neat blue border. There was a simple wooden step up to the door. Around it the wall was plain, white-painted stonework. Instead of approaching, however, worried that she might find the door locked and her little adventure would end too soon and in disappointment, Charlotte went around to the far side of the building. As she came around the church's flank, Charlotte saw that one of her assumptions about the place had been wrong. She had expected to find that it was built on a little plateau, possibly man-made, and entirely separate from the rocky outcrop that glowered behind it. It was not. The rear of the church was built up against the base of the natural cliff. Going closer, she saw that the mortar that joined the church's wall to the cliff was spread thickly, so that no gaps remained. Under the paint, different-sized stones had been used to ensure that the wall fitted as snugly as possible. She could see the irregular lattice of them. The wall itself was plain, except for a single dark window of quartered glass set just below the roof. The window was low enough for Charlotte to be able to see through if she went close, as the building was only single-story. Along from the window, a metal and glass lamp hung from a bracket, and she gave a little private cheer. Her assumption about the nighttime lights had, at least, been correct. She resisted the temptation to look through the window for the same reason that she had not tried the door. She wanted to save the inside of the building for as long as possible. Instead, she turned away from the church to look at the land around it. It was beautiful. What appeared to be scrub from half a mile's distance was actually a thickly knotted tangle of plants and small trees. The air was heavy with the smell of jasmine and curcuma and other unidentifiable but equally rich scents. Butterflies chased each other around the branches, and lazy bees drifted somnolently from flower to flower. Their buzzing came to Charlotte in a sleepy wave, rising and falling in pitch like the roll of the sea. Underlying it was the sound of crickets and grasshoppers, an insistent whirring that was at the same time both frantic and curiously relaxing. The press of plants and insects, and the birds that darted and hovered in irregular patterns above it all, was held back by the stone walls surrounding the church. In places the walls bulged, and roots pushed their way between the rough stones. The only break in the stonework was a rusted iron gate. Past the gate there was a gap in the flora, and an earthen track that led away along the base of the cliff. Here the dark green leaves and branches and the blooming flowers had been cut and pushed back, so that they formed an archway over the gate and made living, breathing walls for the path. Charlotte stood, breathing in the scented air and luxuriating in the quiet. If Roger were there, she thought, he'd be taking photographs, pointing out interesting creatures or sounds, asking if I was okay, if I wanted anything. Being there allowed her to just be, unfettered by expectation or implication or demand. It was the most relaxed she had felt during her entire holiday. Finally Charlotte walked back around to the front of the church. She intended to go and try the door, but instead she carried on walking, going to the right side of the building. It was, as she expected, the same as the other side, only in reverse. The window was dark, and the lamp's brass fittings were shiny with age. There was another gate in the surrounding wall, also rusted, although looking closely she saw that the hinges were well oiled and clean, and another path along the base of the cliff. She wondered if it was simply the end of the path that started around the other side, and which travelled all the way around the base of the great ragged cube, and decided that it probably was. She smiled at the simplicity of it and its unrefined, functional beauty. Through the window, Charlotte thought she could see a light inside the building. She moved closer, brushing away a thin layer of sand and dust from the glass, and peering through into the interior of the church. What she saw disappointed her. Other Greek Orthodox chapels that Charlotte had visited, both large and small, had been extensively decorated, with pictures of saints lining the lower part of the walls, scenes from the life of Jesus above them. As a teaching aid, Roger had told her pompously in a church they had visited earlier in the week. Remember, the peasants couldn't read, so the pictures could be used by the priests to illustrate what they were saying. She had remained silent after he spoke, not trusting herself to say anything pleasant to him, so irritated was she at his thoughtless condescension. Icons, frequently of the Holy Mother and Child, lined the walls of those other churches, their silver and gold plate, to protect the picture beneath, more from Roger, shining in the light from the devotional candles that burned in trays of sand. The little blue and white church, however, had none of this. The walls were bare of pictures, painted or framed. There were no candles or chairs or tapestries here. Indeed, the only decoration seemed to be mirrors in ornate frames. There was one above the door, one behind the altar, and one opposite her to the side of the window. The altar, which she expected at the very least to be bedecked with a delicately stitched altar cloth, was a simple table partly covered with what looked like a plain strip of white material. 2 candles in simple silver candlesticks burned, one at each end. Behind the altar was an open doorway. Seeing it made Charlotte nod to herself. Whilst it was, in other respects, odd, the church was at least conforming to some of what she knew about the Greek Orthodox Church, where chapels had a narthex, a central area where worshippers gathered, and a private area for the priests behind the altar. This was presumably what lay beyond the doorway. Charlotte stepped back from the window, still confused. The inside of the church was so plain that it could have been part of some dark Calvinist chapel, and she wanted to know why this was so different from the exuberant stylings she had seen in other Greek churches. She went back around to the door, confident that she would be able to enter. That candles were burning made her sure there must be a priest there, and that the church would be unlocked. Before she entered, however, she went once more to the top of the path leading from the beach. She was experiencing a little guilt about her feelings towards Roger, and wanted to wave to him, show him some affection. It would make him feel good and might stop him worrying. When she looked, however, she could not find him. There was the fruit and drink stall, there was the family, but Roger was nowhere to be seen. Maybe he had gone to get some shade, she thought. He was paranoid about becoming sunburnt or dehydrated, another little thing about him that irritated her. Maybe he'd got angry waiting for her and taken himself off for an early beer. In a funny way, she hoped that this was the case. It would be a spark of adventurousness, a small reminder of the Roger she first met and liked, who'd surprised her and made her laugh. Swallowing a surprisingly large hitch of disappointment, Charlotte turned back to the church. As the sun now rose higher, the church's shadows were creeping back towards it like whipped dogs, and its white walls gleamed. The domed blue roof was bright in the sun, and the reflection of the light off the white walls was so sharp that she had to narrow her eyes as she approached the door. Whilst she expected it to be open, there was still a part of her that wondered if it might resist her push, but she never had the chance to find out. Even as she reached for the handle, the door swung open to reveal an old man who looked at her silently. The man was dressed in a simple black robe, tied at the waist with a belt of rope. His beard was a pepper of white and grey and black, and a white cloth was draped over the crown of his head. Under the cloth, Charlotte saw long hair that fell in ringlets past his shoulders. He wore sandals, and his toenails were long and curled. "Welcome to the island of the Church of the Order of St. John of Patmos. My name is Babbas," the man said, and bowed. He straightened up slowly and walked by Charlotte without another word. As he went, she caught an unpleasant whiff of sour body odour and another sweeter smell that was, if anything, even less pleasant. Babbas was fully 8 inches shorter than Charlotte, and as he walked by she could see the top of his head with its cloth covering. What she had taken for white was, she saw, actually a dirty yellow. It was stained with countless greasy rings, all overlapping like cup stains on an unvarnished table. With a little jolt of disgust, Charlotte realized that the rings were marks from his hair, from where it pressed against the linen. She took an involuntary step back from him, shocked and surprised in equal measure. "Why doesn't he wash?" she thought, and took another step away. He stopped and turned to her. "This is a small church, with few facilities," he said, as though reading her thoughts. "Come, I will show you around and explain what needs to be done." His English was excellent, but she could still detect an accent there, Greek, almost definitely. Babbas spoke slowly, as though thinking about each word before he uttered it, and she wondered if this was because he was speaking a language that was not his own. His eyes were a faded blue, circled by wrinkles and overhung by heavy grey eyebrows. He looked at her intently, and then sprung around again and walked on. His walk was not an old man's shuffle precisely, but Charlotte saw that he did not pick his feet far up off the ground, and his steps were not long. "Each day, before sunset," Babbas said, walking around to the left of the church, "the lamps must be lit. There are 6. 1 here, 1 on the other side of the church, and 4 at points around the island. The path will take you there. It goes all the way around this rock and comes out on the other side of the church." Silently Charlotte gave herself another cheer. 1 point for me, she thought. I already worked that out. Babbas was looking speculatively along the path, and Charlotte stepped next to him. She was pleased to find that the scents from the plants and flowers covered the old man's own odour. "It looks beautiful, does it not?" asked Barras, but did not wait for a response. "It is, now, but it can be a long walk around the island even in good weather. In winter it is treacherous. The path becomes slippery when it is wet, and the wind can be harsh, but the work is vital. All 4 sides of this rock must be lit with light from a flame throughout every night. Each morning the lamps must be extinguished and filled in preparation for being lit again that forthcoming night. This means that the morning walk is often the harder, as you must carry the oil with you in a can." He sighed. Standing next to the old man gave Charlotte the opportunity to study him more closely. His face was deeply lined, and his skin was the dark brown of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors. Except for his dress, which seemed too simple, he acted as though he were in charge here. He must be the priest, she thought. Why else would he be here? Perhaps this parish isn't well off enough to afford to buy nice robes or icons for the church. I mean, it can't have many regular parishioners, can it? Even as she thought this, her eyes were taking in more details about him. His beard hung down to his chest, and his hands were ridged with prominent veins. There was something else about him, though, something harder to identify. It took her a moment to recognize it, but when she did, Charlotte was a little surprised. He seemed sad. The 2 of them stood in silence, looking down the path along the base of the cliff for so long that it began to make Charlotte uncomfortable. She wanted to ask the man something, but she did not know what. Besides, he did not give the impression of wanting to talk. True, he had started to tell her about the church, but not in an especially welcoming way. It reminded her of the lectures she had attended at university, given by tutors who saw teaching as a chore. "Come," said the priest suddenly, making Charlotte jump. "There is much to show you." Barras walked back towards the church, not looking at Charlotte as he went. She followed, feeling something between amusement and irritation at the man's brusque manner. As he walked into the church, however, she stopped. "Wait a minute, please," Charlotte said. "I can't come in dressed like this, can I?" She gestured down at her bikini, her naked legs and belly and shoulders now prickling in the sun. She wished she had brought sunscreen and a sarong with her. She could have tied them in a waterproof bag and towed it along with her sandals. "Why?" asked the old man. "Don't I have to cover my shoulders and legs out of respect? I've had to do that for the other Greek churches I've been in." The priest looked at Charlotte as though seeing her properly for the first time. He let his gaze drop from her face down her body, and she began to wonder if she was safe here alone with him. Before she had time to pursue this thought, however, he raised his gaze to her face again and sighed, as though terribly tired. "God made both skin and cloth, and loves you equally in both," he said. "He is with you dressed and undressed. He is in your clothes and so always sees you as naked. He is God and sees us all as naked all the time. What use are clothes to him? Religion, churches and chapels and monasteries often forget that God sees beyond the covers that we put around the world. They forget that the ceremonies they perform have function, have purpose beyond simple tradition or habit or worship. When ceremonies and rules become all important, then God is forgotten. Here the ceremonies are about a purpose. They have a function. They are not about simply the look or the sound or the history of things. You may enter this church of the Order of St. John of Patmos dressed however you wish, as long as you respect the work that is done here, and not just the ceremony that surrounds it." He stopped and sighed again, as though exhausted by his speech. Charlotte, unsure whether to be embarrassed by her lack of clothes, or by the fact that she had asked about her lack of clothes and so drawn attention to it, simply nodded and followed him into the church. The inside of the small building was not as plain as it had appeared from the outside. There were decorations of a sort, but it was delicate and subtle. A black strip was painted along the base of the walls, stretching about 3 inches up from the floor. The top of the black strip was irregular, dipping and rising as it went around the room. When Babbas closed the door behind her, Charlotte saw that the strip had been painted across the bottom of it as well. Above the black strip, the walls were painted a light yellow. There were small streaks of orange in the yellow, along with tiny flecks of blue and green. The church was lit by the candles on its altar and by the sunlight coming in through the windows. The mirrors on the walls, and there was one on each wall, she saw, caught the light and reflected it all around, catching the streaks of colour on the walls and making them dance in the corner of her eyes. It was like being at the centre of a vast, calm flame, and it was magical in a way she had not expected. The air had a warmth that held her softly, and she laughed in delight at it. The old man, hearing this, smiled for the first time and did not seem so sad.
"It is wonderful, is it not?" asked Babbas.
"It's beautiful," Charlotte answered, although this did not do justice to how beautiful or wonderful it was.
"The order of St. John of Patmos, here and elsewhere, is charged with the maintenance of the light of God, and we try to love the light wherever possible. It is not an easy life here on the island. There is only one delivery of food and equipment a week, and between those times it can be lonely. These altar candles must always be aflame, as must other torches that we will come to soon. There must always be enough fuel, enough candles, enough torches, and this takes planning, so that the necessary items can be ordered at least a week in advance, to come in with the following week's delivery. But when it is hard, and when the life I have had given to me seems tiring, I need simply stand in here and feel the beauty and power of God and his love, and I know that I am valued, that I am playing my part in the worship of the light over the darkness." He stopped talking, and his face fell into sadness and tiredness once more. Charlotte wondered why Babbas was telling her these things, but dared not ask. Wasn't this what she had come here for after all? And besides, it was interesting, listening to this old man. Such single-mindedness, she thought briefly. I'm not sure I could do what he does, day in, day out. After reading her thoughts again, Babbas said, "It is not always so. Sometimes there are more here than just me. In past years, this place has housed 4 or 5 of the called at a time, and we were able to split the daily tasks between us."
"Jesus, you mean there's just you by yourself?" exclaimed Charlotte, startled, and fast on the heels of this came embarrassment at having sworn in church. Babbas seemed not to notice, however, but simply sighed again and turned away. He walked to the rear of the church, going behind the altar. He went to the doorway and stopped, calling back over his shoulder,
"Come."
This time Charlotte did not move. It was not just the peremptory way in which he had called her, although that was irritating to be sure. No, it was also that the idea of going behind the altar, of entering the place where only those who served God as priests or higher could go, that made her uncomfortable. Whilst her own faith was at best questionable, she had been raised in a family that respected, even if it did not believe. She found it hard to disagree with members of the clergy, and even thinking critical or dismissive thoughts about the church's ceremonies or regulations made her feel guilty. She sometimes felt it was this inability as much as anything that stopped her from taking the final step and dismissing the teaching of the church as simple superstition, and that this was a weakness in her that she should try to overcome. But she did not. Hard though it was to admit it even to herself, she liked that the church had mysteries, and felt that revealing them would be akin to stripping away layers of her upbringing and replacing them with something smaller and infinitely more miserable. Seeing behind the altar would solve one of those mysteries, and the thought of it made her sad. She could not articulate this, knowing it made little sense. Rather, she remained still and hoped that the old man would return, would show her something else instead of what lay in the private inner sanctum.
"Come, now,"
said Babbas from the darkness, and he no longer sounded old or tired. but implacable. He loomed into the light briefly, waving her towards him and saying in the same tone of voice,
"There is much to show you."
Miserably, feeling far worse than when she thought of losing Roger, she followed him. She had expected to find a small chamber beyond the doorway, but was surprised to find a long passage cut into rock, lit by candles set into carved recesses. These recesses were at head height, and occurred every 5 or 6 feet along the passage. The smell of smoke and old flames was strong, but under it the same sickly, corrupt odour from before caught in Charlotte's nose. Babas was already some distance down the passage, walking in that stooped half-shuffle that she had begun to recognise. Wondering what other surprises were in store, she hurried after him. The slap of her sandals echoed around her as she walked, the sound coming at her from all angles. She saw as she passed that behind each candle, painted on the back of the recesses, were portraits of people. There were both men and women, all unsmiling and serious-looking. All were wearing a white cloth over their heads, and all had dates across the base of the portraits. In the flickering light of the candles, their eyes seemed to follow her, and their lips pursed in disapproval. As much to break the silence and draw her attention from their gaze as anything, Charlotte called ahead to the old man. "Who are the people in the portraits?"
"The previous leaders of the order here."
"But there are women," she said before she could stop herself. Babas turned back to her. There was light from somewhere ahead, and for a moment he was simply a silhouette in the passage. He stretched his arms out, placing his palms against the walls. Leaning forward, he let his arms take his weight. His face came into the light, and Charlotte saw his teeth gleaming a terrible ivory. He stared at her and smiled, although there was no humour in it.
"This is not a branch of the Orthodox Church," he said, "and we have always known that God gave women the same role to play in the struggle between good and evil as men. He cares not whether it is a man or a woman who lights the candles and lamps and torches, as long as they are lit. Try to understand. This place has a function, a purpose, beyond simply mouthing words and performing ceremonies, the reason for whose existence most have forgotten. To these walls, men and women are called equally to play their role as God intended."
He glared fiercely at Charlotte, and then whirled about, his belt ends and the hem of his robe flailing around him. Charlotte, against her better, more rational judgment, followed. The passage opened out into a cave that took Charlotte's breath away. It looked as if the whole of the huge outcrop of rock in the island's centre had been hollowed out. Looking up, she saw a roof far above her that was ragged with gullies and peaks, like a sonar map of deep ocean floors. Here and there chisel marks were visible, and she realized that this must have been a natural opening in the rock, and that man had expanded what nature, God, she wondered fleetingly, had begun. The floor was inlaid with white marble, and the walls were painted the same yellow and orange as the church, although there was no black stripe around the base of the walls. At either side of her, doorways were set into the wall, carved rectangles of darker air. The nearest one, she saw, opened into a small carved room that appeared to contain nothing but a bed. "He lives here as well," she thought in surprise. And then her eyes were drawn to what lay in the centre of the cavern. There was a large opening in the floor. Charlotte walked to the opening, beckoned on by Babas, who had gone to stand at its edge. It was roughly square, and at each corner was a burning torch set on top of a metal stand. Lamps burned around the walls, she noticed, and then she was looking into the hole. It was pitch black. Charlotte stared down and immediately felt dizzy, as though she were having an attack of vertigo, and in truth it was like looking down from a great height. The darkness in the hole seemed to start just feet below its rim, as if it were filled with inky water. Why doesn't the light go into it? She had time to think. And then Babas's hand was on her shoulder and he drew her gently away. He guided her back to where she had been standing, to where the floor was all around her, gleaming and white.
There is the function of the Order of St. John of Patmos, he said in a soft voice. We keep the light burning that holds the darkness at bay, and it is what you have come here to do.
Charlotte stood, breathing deeply to overcome her dizziness. The old man stood looking at her kindly. His eyes glimmered with what? Expectation? Hope? She could not tell. And then the thing that he had said last of all lurched in her memory, and the individual words connected made a sentence, gained meaning. "I'm not here to do anything," she said loudly. "I just wanted to look around."
"Of course you did not," said Babas, and the sadness was there again in his voice, the sound of a teacher coaxing a particularly slow child. "You were called here, as I was before you, and as the others were before me. No one comes here to look. We come because God needs us."
"No," Charlotte said as emphatically as she could. "I wanted to see the church. Now I've seen it, I'll go. Thank you for showing it to me." She took a step back, moving towards the passageway. Babas did not move, but simply said,
"You may leave, if you wish, of course. I shall not stop you. But you will find that the world has already forgotten you."
Charlotte opened her mouth to say something, anything to counter the oddly threatening madness that was coming from the old man's mouth. But nothing came. She wanted to tell him that he was insane, that the place she had made for herself in the world was as secure as it had ever been. But instead the thought of Roger popped unbidden into her mind. Or rather the memory that Roger had been gone when she looked for him a second time. Could he have forgotten her? Gone back to their hotel room because she no longer existed for him? No, it was madness. She was real. She had a home, a job, a boyfriend.
"He has forgotten you,"
said Babas, once more guessing at what she was thinking, seeing her thoughts and fears reflected in her expression.
"Already the skin of the world is healing over the place you have left in it. In a few days no trace of you will be left. Now your place is here."
Charlotte stared at the old man and took another step towards the passage. He was looking at her with that calm, lecture's assurance, confident in the absolute truth of what he was saying. She wanted to say, "That's impossible," but she dared not speak. Saying anything would be an admittance of the fact that just for a moment she had wondered. And in her wondering, Babas's words attained a sort of reality. But he couldn't be right, could he? It was an absurdity spouted by an old man driven mad by solitude and religious extremism. Wasn't it? How could he believe it? She asked herself, and in that moment she realized she did not want to leave yet. She had to persuade him of his folly, make him see that he was wrong. Frantically she went through the things she could say that might puncture his reality and let hers in. Finally she came across what she felt was the perfect argument. "But I can't," she said. "I don't believe. And how can I have been called if I don't believe?" Babas did not reply, and Charlotte thought for the shortest time that she'd done it. She had made him see his error. But then, the sad little smile never leaving his face, he said,
"Believe in what? This church? This place? It is all around you. More solid than your own flesh can ever hope to be. God, perhaps? Well, he does not care. He exists outside of your beliefs or mine, and he does not need your faith or mine to continue. Ah, but I see that it is not him that you do not believe in, but the function of this place. You think maybe that all here is ceremony without purpose, or that the purpose itself has become obsolete, like the act of watering a dead plant."
Babas's smile widened into a grin that showed his teeth. Under his eyebrows his eyes were lost in pools of flickering shadow.
"This is no place of idle ceremony," he said. "Watch."
Babas took hold of Charlotte's arm in a grip that was gentle but unyielding and pulled her to one corner of the pit in the floor. Nodding at her, he took hold of the torch and removed it from the bracket in the floor. Holding it high over his head like a lantern, he retreated to the far side of the cavern and stood in the entrance to the passage. With the torch above him, The light danced more frenziedly. The walls, their colours melting and merging, were flames about Charlotte's skin, and wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach, she felt herself try to retreat from them. She made to step away, but with his free hand Babbas gestured to the pit by her feet. She looked down. The surface of the darkness was writhing and bucking. Even as she gasped in surprise and fear, Charlotte imagined some great creature roiling and thrashing just below the surface of inky water. There were no reflections within the pit or the boiling darkness. Charlotte never knew how long she watched the moving darkness. It may have been 1 minute or 1 hour. She only knew that she was mesmerized by the rippling thing that moved before her. There was no light in it, but there were colours, things she could neither name nor even recognize, flashes and sparks and flows that moved and swirled and came and went. She felt herself become trapped in it, like a fly in amber, and it was only with an effort that she pulled herself away, brought her mind back into herself. The darkness in the corner of the pit nearest her had risen. The black moving thing had crept up and was lapping at the edge of the pit, and tiny strands of it had slithered out onto the marble floor. It no longer looked to Charlotte like a liquid, but like some shadowed thing slowly reaching out tentacles, sending them questing across the marble floor. They reminded her of tree roots groping blindly through the earth for sustenance. Even as she watched, the first tendril had found a patch of shadow, cast by the holder from which Babbas had removed the torch. The tendril, or root, or feeler, she did not know how to explain what she was seeing, writhed furiously as it reached the shadow, thickening and pulsing. The shadow itself seemed to bulge and sway, and then it was solid, more solid than it ought to be. She could not see the floor through it. More tendrils found other shadows, moving with a greedy hunger, and with them came a sound. It was the noise of insects in the night time, of unidentifiable slitherings and raspings, of rustling feet and creaking, ominous walls. Claws clicked across hard floors and breathing came, low and deep. There was the whisper of saliva slipping down teeth as yellow and huge as the bones of long-dead monsters, of hate given voice and pain that hummed in the blood. Charlotte tried to scream as the noise slipped about her, but the air became locked in her throat as she looked at her feet and saw that the questing tendrils had reached her. They caressed her gently, and then the shadows between her toes thickened, became as impenetrable as velvet. When she tried to lift her foot to kick them away, she felt them cling with a warm tenacity that nuzzled gently at her instep and the back of her ankle. It was soft, like the touch of a lover, and it pulsed with a rhythm all of its own. And then she screamed. Charlotte stumbled back as she screamed, and it seemed to her as she stumbled that her own shadow felt different, had a weight and a solidity that it had never had before. She felt it hold on to her knees and ankles, slipping across her skin like rough silk. She kicked out, knowing the irrationality of being frightened of her own shadow, but kicking none the less. And then her back hit something else, something warm, and she screamed even louder. The warm thing wrapped itself around her, and she caught a flash of light at her side. She recognized the same sweet, sickly smell as she had caught before. And then Babbas was saying in her ear,
"It is all right. Do not panic."
The old man had the torch in front of Charlotte, its flaming head close to the floor. He swept it around in great arcs, forcing it into the shadows and using it as though he were driving an animal away. He was breathing hard, the air coming from his mouth in heavy puffs across her cheek. It was warm and moist and made her want to cringe. The heat of the torch flashed near her foot and she yelped in surprise and pain. She started to cry, helpless in his arms, tears of frustration and fear and anger rolling down her face. She closed her eyes and waited, useless, until the old man let her go.
"It is gone,"
he said simply. Charlotte heard the rattle of the torch being placed back onto its stand. Trembling, she opened her eyes. The cavern was normal again, or at least as normal as it had been when she first saw it. The walls still seemed to move with a fluid balletic grace around her, the light from the torches giving the colours life. Now the vibrancy she felt was a blessing, something that pinned down the contents of the pit with its warmth and vitality. What was that? She asked, hearing the idiocy of the question, but having to ask anyway.
Darkness,
said Babas.
There are places where darkness gets into the world, through pits and caverns and sunless spots. The Order of St. John of Patmos is dedicated to finding these places, and keeping in them the light of God, keeping the darkness at bay. It has been my job on this island for many years, and now it is yours.
Babas went past Charlotte and stepped through one of the openings carved into the cavern's wall. Charlotte, terrified of being left alone near the pit, scurried after him. At the doorway she stopped, peering through into the shadowed beyond. There was a flare of a match igniting, and then the softer glow of a lantern spread around in tones of red and orange, revealing a small room. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves bristled with leather-bound books, their spines black despite the light. The far wall was curtained off, and in front of the curtains was a desk. Its scarred surface held an open journal and a pen.
This is where the records are written, said Babas, gesturing first at the open journal, and then at the books lining the shelves. The activities of each day are listed, written in confirmation of their completion.
Charlotte, interested despite herself, said, Are these the records for the whole order?
No, only this church. The order has churches in other places, and they keep their records as they see fit.
How many other churches?
I do not know. People are called and the order receives them. We do not move around. There are many places where darkness can escape into the world, and, when the order discovers them, it takes in light to combat it. That there is still darkness means we have not found all of the places. Now we must go. There are things to do.
Charlotte wanted to refuse, tell him that she could not leave her life behind. But the sheer size and complexity of the loss she was facing meant that the words would not fit around it. No more saunas, she thought. No more work or going out at lunchtime with friends. No more nights curled up on the sofa with a bottle of wine watching a movie. No more pizza or restaurants. No more telephone calls. No more life. I can't, she thought hopelessly. I can't do it. And yet, as she thought, she heard again that slithering chitinous noise and remembered the darkness slipping across her feet like the warm kiss of some terrible moistureless mouth. And she could not turn him down. Instead she said, Why can't you carry on? A question she knew to avoid her own final acceptance.
I am dying,
Babas said.
I have something growing inside me, and it is killing me. I cannot carry the oil for the lamps any more. I am slow. I have not done so yet, but one day I will slip and fall, or forget something, and then it will escape. I can stay and teach you, but I cannot carry the responsibility any longer. It is why God called you.
He removed the stained white cloth from his head and came towards her, holding it out in front of him reverently. She saw the marks of the old grease that stained it like tree rings denoting age, and smelled the sickly scent of his decaying, dying flesh.
We wear this, those of us who carry the burden,
Babas said.
It is perhaps our only symbolic act, the only thing we do that is devoid of true function. This is the mantle of light.
So saying, Babas draped the cloth over Charlotte's hair so that it hung down, brushing her shoulders. It smelt old and sour. Babas smiled at her and stepped back, as the weight of centuries settled on Charlotte's head.